We're going to go into no introduction mode here because these guys are way more interesting than I am. Why don't you guys come up? We've got Tim Armstrong and Steve King, who are two of my favorite people. I've known Tim too long, and Steve almost as long, and they're just going to have a real good rip-roaring discussion about the media environment circa 2016, the digital media environment. So go for it, guys.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, Spencer. Hi, everybody. I think there's 15,000 attendees here at this VivaTech, and I think Tim and I can be distinguished because we're the only two people out of 15,000 wearing a tie. I don't know why that's about. So we were talking about our kids before we started, and I rang home this morning, and my son said to me, "What are you doing today?" I said, "Hey, I'm interviewing Tim Armstrong." He said, "Wow, that's really cool." I said, "Really, you think that's cool?" He said, "Yeah, I know all about him. He was the first man to walk on the moon." He said, "No." I said, "That was Neil Armstrong, and I think sadly he passed away a couple of years ago." And then I told him I'm interviewing Tim Armstrong from AOL, and he said, "Wow, what do you know about AOL?" So we're going to see what we know. So real pleasure to spend half an hour or so with Tim here. You know, we know each other pretty well. You know, in my organization, running a global media organization of Publicis Media, you know, we've worked with Tim and his organization over many years. I'm sure you all know Tim in terms of his history. Started off having left college as a journalist, many innovative companies like Starwave, and then notably spent 10 years in senior roles at Google in the US, sat on their leadership board, and then joined AOL, I guess about 6 years ago. Is that right? And I'm sure you know how AOL has sort of transformed itself. Now is a digital leader in terms of technology, ad technology, digital journalism, and has really made a tremendous transformation. You'll see many of the acquisitions. You'll know about Huffington, about Millennial, etc. So, and then that culminated about a year ago with the acquisition by another one of our clients, by Verizon, for $4.4 billion. So I'm sure we're not going to be short of things to talk about today. So a nice, gentle thing to start you with. You know, when you first considered the role moving across from Google to AOL, I mean, why did you take that job, and what were your first impressions going in? And were those impressions correct once you actually arrived at AOL?
First, it's great to be here, and Steve, I've known you for a long time, and Spencer, so it's the other thing that's amazing to be here is I was at Maurice Levy's office when he basically described what he wanted this to be, and it's amazing to see it in physical context in a very short period of time, and be a huge benefit for France overall. You know, my philosophy when leaving Google was basically, I have a personal philosophy, which is our opportunities are opportunities because other people can't see them. And one of the opportunities that at least I think that our leadership team saw when we joined AOL was the future of content and how, you know, things like advertising would change over time. And, you know, when we got to AOL, the company was, you know, positioned as still a large player, but had a serious decline behind it, and companies like Google and Facebook and other companies had kind of really moved into the centerpiece. So, you know, our agenda was to turn the company around, to make work fun and exciting, to get on the front end of products and services, but really to actually invest directly against what most people were investing against. And I think that was probably the best decision we made as a company was back then we went into content brands, into video, and into programmatic advertising. And those things at the time period weren't popular. When we bought the Huffington Post, you know, we were a public company, our stock dropped by 20 or 25% the minute we announced it, you know, overall, because the world did not believe in content. And when you look at today where the world is, you know, you look at what's happening in the world of content overall, it's one of the best places to invest. So I think what I saw was the opportunity to have a really large-scale company most people had given up on or forgotten about, and to take that company and point it in a direction which was probably against the grain in the industry, and that's how we've ended up where we are today. I think we have some big thoughts for 2020, like some more against the grain type things that we want to do, and that's something that we're working on. So it's been 6 years. It's been a hard 6 years. I think leaving Google is an unbelievably great company. They're executing really well. They are in a great position globally, and I love that company, but I love AOL, and we've had a great time there.
So I think, you know, I don't think there's a meeting that I go into with anybody, any stakeholder in our business, be it a client or a media partner, where we don't use the words disruption and transformation, and this is no exception. And obviously, as we know, change isn't made easily. It's easy to come up with that blueprint. It's hard to execute against that. So you talked about some of the challenges there about dealing externally, what happened about the share price when you acquired Huffington Post. Do you find that change and making that transformation is harder to convince people externally or internally?
Yeah, I think it's both. I have there's a famous saying, culture eats strategy, for breakfast. I would put on top of that your execution is the fork. And if you're not willing to really boldly invest in the culture and not willing to really focus on execution, the strategy doesn't matter. And I think any time as a business when you're in a disruption zone overall, the external world is going to have lots of opinions about what the disruption is and what you're doing. It's the internal world that actually drives all the change. So I think we spend a lot of time focused on the internal, get the internal company right, and regardless of what the external world thinks, let's focus on that. So we did a lot of things out of the gates that basically were very cultural in nature, like we have a thing called Employees First, which I basically have promised all the time, whether it's good news or bad news, they'll never hear it outside the company before they hear it inside the company. And there's many companies where some people get news outside of their company before they get it internally. So that there's things like that to drive change overall. And I'd say the second thing, which is important, and you and I have talked about this before, is we set these kind of very lofty goals, and we failed towards the goals. Like we basically zigged and zagged, zigged and zagged, zigged and zagged, but we knew where we were going. And I think the case, if you're going to disrupt your own business or disrupt something, you have to be clear about the goal, because you're going to face a lot of failure on the way to the goal. I think disruption doesn't work, and this happened to us sometimes too, is if you don't have a goal and you're just trying things, it's more like floundering than failing. And I think failure is an important part of success as long as you have goals and you're failing toward a goal. So I think disruption for me started with internal culture, internal goals, making sure people knew the goals, and then really being okay taking big risks and failing towards something. And we failed enough and figured things out enough. Overall, I just had our leadership meeting in Manhattan with the top 300 people from AOL. And the number one cultural thing I put up is, our business philosophy and strategy is the Mike Tyson rule, which is Mike Tyson, the famous boxer, has a saying that says, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And in business, you end up getting punched in the face a lot on the way to where you're going, and you're going to have to change your plan. So I think having the goal of trying to be the best in the world and then realizing you have to fight your way to get there is the most important part of disruption.
I've never heard anyone use Mike Tyson as a business guru, so that's very refreshing. I think, when we've got here today, as you know, we've got many startups and many established businesses like yours and some even larger, like we've just heard from Sheryl Sandberg there. I mean, I know you've seen both sides of that fence. You've obviously worked in startups, and as we look at the sort of tech challenges facing the very large established companies and how they're continually having to reinvent themselves as they are, what would you think the challenges facing the different side of companies? Whether you talk a very established player or the smaller startup. And I think a number of the people in the audience might be interested to think about how those challenges are sort of dealt with in the different scale of the company that you come from.
I mean, I see two distinct challenges, because we're a medium-sized company, but we have invested in a lot of startups, so I spend time with both. And I'd say on the big company side, most big companies have a bigger brand than their aspirations are. The big companies are always looking down at the startups and wondering how they get to be more like a startup. And I think sometimes big brands under-leverage the power they have to actually look up and to focus on how they're going to disrupt forward, because there's going to be a lot of people chasing you all the time. And I think on the smaller company side, most smaller companies have great ideas, but they have no brand. And so the two size companies are exact reverses of each other. And I think that closing that gap, if you're a big company, you want to basically force yourself to look forward and try to do really exceptionally large things at scale and move really quickly. And if you're a small company, I think you want to aspire to build a brand over time. And those two cultures sometimes are in conflict with each other. But I think going back to kind of setting really clear, aspirations, if you're a big company or a small company, it's important to look forward. Most of the big companies, and this has been a problem for us over time, and it was a big problem at AOL for a long time, is if you're a big company, a big brand, and you're constantly looking behind you in the rearview mirror to see who's coming up, you're generally not watching the road in front of you, and you're probably going to have an accident overall. And if you're a small company and all you do is pine away to have a big company, big companies are built like one small step at a time, 1,000 steps, as fast as you can go. And I think as a smaller company trying to build a big brand, speed is your strategic weapon, and you got to move really quickly.
So in terms of that speed, I know you've obviously got a blueprint of where you're going, and I love that. And I'm going back to that Mike Tyson analogy, and when you're actually looking at your business, do you positively seek ways of disrupting your business? And if you do, how do you actually look for what those levers are?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. Like we bought this company, Riot, the Huffington Post, which we own, invested in the company Riot, and now Riot is helping us do augmented reality and virtual reality across the whole company. And I was with the Riot people yesterday in New York, and the challenges inside of a company about how to basically disrupt yourself is the reality is the Riot people inside of our company. We have 6,000 employees. We have 30 or 40 employees who work at Riot. Those are the best employees at our company who know AR and VR the best. And the biggest danger for us is everybody around the company wants to be in AR and VR, but we really should be learning from the Riot people about how to do that. And I think forcing our company to basically interact and collaborate also is really important. A lot of companies basically spend a lot of time, I call it coordinating and aligning, but coordinating and aligning doesn't actually get physical. And I think there are times where you need to take leaders from different areas of your business and put them in other areas and force leadership disruption, because I think a lot of disruption comes from teams seeing the ability to basically try things and fail. And the word invention is probably an underused word. Like what you guys are doing at Publicis, reorganizing globally around it, I'm guessing, maybe I'm wrong, but you probably have to invent a whole bunch of different ways to figure out how to go to clients, what to bring them, how to bring in a new structure. And if you tell people, hey, your job is to invent, I don't care if you fail, keep inventing, invent. I think you're going to see you'll probably see a lot of growth is messy. You'll see some mess, but you'll also see some unbelievable things about disrupting yourself. There's people in your organization, and in my organization, other organizations, who are 2 or 3 levels down, who are crazy talented, and finding those people and let them disrupt is really important.
I think Tim and I have spoken before, and we've talked about the difficulty of making change with people. And the watch out I always find is when people come and say, hey, I really embrace change. It's the people who say that. You try and get them to move from one chair to the next. They never do that. So I'd like to just move on a bit, because obviously, as we know, I think last May you made the acquisition that was made by Verizon of AOL, 4.4 billion. And I'm going to go on and ask about where, if you can, talk about Yahoo potentially, where you see that in the ecosystem. But before I get there, obviously, I'd just like you to explain, Tim, to everybody about your vision for AOL today, where you think media technology has a role, about content development and content distribution, and then as part of that, how Verizon might be an amplifier against that vision.
So at a most simple level, we want to build the world's largest mobile brands that people love. And our internal mission statement is build brands people love. And technology is awash in the world today, but our fundamental belief is that brands are going to become infinitely more important in the future. So when Verizon acquired us, our theory on the future is the following, and it may be incorrect, but you're going to have 3.5 billion additional people connected with machines. I mean, people call them phones, but they're really machines. The Earth has never had every human being with a machine against it, and that's going to dramatically shift the way we interact with things. And our concept is something internally we call reverse commerce, which is the machine is going to essentially filter. It's your second brain. It's going to filter everything you do. So doing the deal with Verizon is the highest quality mobile network in the United States for us, and we're going to expand into more international categories with other mobile providers. But for us, it was forcing our company to basically make mobile the center of our company and to make sure that we're building brands at the center of our company. And underneath brand building, there's 2 kind of important attributes. One is creative differentiation, What is your brand doing that's different than any other brand in the world? And can you explain it in one sentence? And the second is data. Data is really important in terms of serving consumers and customers the right object at the right time. So Verizon offered us that overall as a business, and I think it was probably the best decision we ever made. Frankly, also at our size company, we had to bring really big scale resources. You see how well Google and Facebook are performing. We can't show up without an army. And we really needed to have a much bigger platform, and Verizon has offered us that, a lot more resources and a lot more mobile.
From the outside, the logic to us seemed really strong because you get access to mobile and data and customers. Would you differentiate between those, or it was an aggregation of all three of those assets that Verizon brings?
You could answer the question for me. That was it. It's customers, data, and scale. I mean, that's at the end of the day. If you deal in the mobile space, it's really hard to get scale on mobile, and that's a critical element of the Verizon deal.
Okay, so another partner we obviously had an interesting journey with is obviously Yahoo, and clearly that's on the blocks now. It's for sale, and Verizon has clearly been one of the potential acquirers. I don't know whether you're allowed or whether you can just tell us, obviously confidentially, where that stands at the moment.
Yeah, I would say, one is we don't comment on other companies, their processes overall, so I can't really comment on it. I would say Yahoo is and I've said this publicly 100 times, Yahoo's a very strong global company with 1 billion users behind it, overall. So whatever they decide to do, I think Yahoo will be a big part of the future of the ecosystem, overall. And they're big partners of ours now. We do lots of stuff with Yahoo, and I'm as interested as anybody to see what comes out of their process, but I can't comment on it.
Okay. As expected. Okay, let's just go on. I think one of the things I know you've said in the past, and I certainly believe, is that there is this plethora of ad tech companies. Let's say more than 200, and that seems to be an oversupply. And I think you've said that you believe there's going to be a consolidation of those companies. That doesn't seem to have happened in the last year, perhaps surprisingly. What do you think will happen in that ecosystem? There are a lot of ad tech companies here of differing scale. When and how do you think that transformation will happen within that ad tech ecosystem?
I think just looking at the landscape of ad tech right now, basically, I think there's three big dynamics happening. One is you're having Google and Facebook that have got lots of momentum and have done a good job executing, and I think they are the two largest players, obviously taking over 50% of share out of the ad business overall. So I think that's a dynamic on its own. I think the second dynamic is that the ecosystem is shifting, where you're seeing the social media players start to get into content and start to truly try to attract first-party users and open up their ad system. So if you look at what Snapchat's doing, Facebook's doing, a lot of them are starting to open up for third-party monetization overall. So I think that will be another trend. And the third trend, I think, which is going to be really important in ad tech, is I do think there's going to be consolidation over time. It's really important as an ad tech player that when I was growing up in the space, and you were probably growing up in the space, you could have your own ad system that ran on your owned and operated properties in general. And I think ad systems that will be successful in the future will be successful inside the entire ecosystem overall. And you'll have to be an ecosystem player versus just an owned and operated singular player. And I'd be interested on your case if you see this on your end. But it's hard to draw the line between competition and cooperation inside of the industry, and I think that's going to blur more, and the ad tech players that are able to play inside of cooperation will be successful, and the ones that aren't able to do that, I think they're going to have a hard time.
Well, I mean, I think from my perspective, it's interesting because you've got obviously two funding models. You've got an ad revenue funded model, and that's growing at a slightly ahead of GDP, and then you've got other e-commerce funding models. So I think from my perspective, I think the ad tech model depends which part of that ecosystem they're operating in, because there's much more finite growth on one side than there is on the other. So, but certainly, I think we anticipate that ad tech business consolidating. I'm just surprised it hasn't happened sooner, because it seems as fragmented now as it was, say, 2 years ago. Yeah, maybe more. I mean, something that certainly our clients continually ask me, and you've talked about the ubiquity and power of Google and Facebook, as you say. One, they're taking more than 50% of global digital advertising. They've got a share of voice, share of mind with consumers, and they're continually, innovating their business. Your former alma mater, Google. 250 innovations last year in terms of the search market. You look what Facebook is doing in terms of video, in terms of mobile now. Messenger. And a question I'm asked, interested in your view as a competitor, can you see a situation in anytime 5 or 10 years hence that they are not going to be the behemoths that they are now? It's at one side of the fence we sit here today. It's hard to see how those businesses are going to be challenged with the scale and breadth of products and services. A lot of untapped potential. I mean, what do you think? Because clearly you're trying to eat away some of that market share, and it's not going to grow exponentially.
I think both of those companies are doing an amazing job. I think if you think about the transitions they both made, Facebook to mobile, Google to video, and Google to mobile with Android, they've done very good jobs of being paranoid and pivoting at the same time to be successful. I'll say this, I think the marketplace is really, really large. We're the marketplace we both play in is a 600 billion plus, 600 billion to $1 trillion marketplace. Vast majority of it still has to transition to the way consumers are working overall. If you made me bet that Google and Facebook were the only successful companies 10 years from now, I would say no. And I'd say no for two reasons. I'd say one, the market's going to expand. I think Google and Facebook will be very successful companies for a very long time to come. But I think the market's going to expand. There'll be openings for more players. And two is, I think we're at the start of disruption around things like AR and VR. I think commerce is going to be something that gets disrupted pretty mightily. And I think also if you look back at the way that content came into existence and what movie people did when movies launched. Nickelodeon, the name Nickelodeon came from people putting nickels in to watch movies, and the first movies were 12 to 20 minutes long. They weren't 3-hour blockbusters. So I think that what you're seeing on the adoption on the young end of the curve right now is the next generation of how content's going to get done. And the bottom line is Facebook and Google are clearly in the lead, and I'm thinking there'll be a third player, a fourth player, a fifth player that emerge over time. That's what we have to bet on, and that's what we have to innovate against. I will say it's enjoyable to compete against Google and Facebook. I think that Google and Facebook set a very high bar for companies to basically perform and how you run your company also. So I think for us, it's a good catalyst, to really get up every morning and try to compete. And I was in New York City, I saw Mayor Bloomberg speak a couple weeks ago, and he said, hey, if you want to be in the Olympics, you got to be able to compete with the world's best. And right now, Facebook and Google are the best. We're working towards it, but it's great competition to compete against.
That's a great answer. Certainly raises the bar. So, you talked about technology, and we've got all sorts of eclectic technology companies represented here, from startups to established companies. We were both in Cannes last week, and you can see how some of these technology innovations, which would have been almost unheard of 2 or 3 years ago. We saw augmented reality really have a commercial application, and we obviously with VR as well. I mean, within your organization, other than those two areas, which are the particular tech companies? I'm sure of a lot of the companies represented here in the audience, interested to know from you, through the lens that you've got, which is slightly different from the other two companies, which are the types of technology you think, this is something you're really watching out for, either at AOL or at Verizon?
I think here are things that are on my mind right now. One is the companies that are purely focused on millennial or younger and how they're going after millennial or younger. I think there's a number of companies that fit into that space. And I think I ran into probably 5 of those companies just either in meetings or walking around. And I think it's very important to watch those companies because they're essentially hooking into how humans are going to behave in the future. I think one company that I have a lot of respect for that I think is doing an amazing job connecting with consumers is Snapchat. And if you think about watching a game experience on Snapchat or any of the event experiences on Snapchat, Discover, and our brands are going on there as well, it's a fundamentally better experience than television. Overall, and I think you have to watch that very closely. If you look at the data and statistics, people under the age of 24 essentially are starting to replace the majority of their viewing with that type of viewing. So I think that's big. And I just want to underline something on augmented reality. Virtual reality is when you're in an experience that's virtual. Augmented reality is when you take an existing experience and slightly augment it. I think there's things coming in augmented reality which will fundamentally change the way that advertising gets done and that media gets done. And it's not ultra complicated. It doesn't require new operating systems and those things. The augmented reality is a very light version of the way to change the world. And instead of looking at a print ad about a car or a print ad about something else, you'll actually be able to look at the print ad, put your phone up to it, and actually experience the entire automobile with no extra work as a consumer. And that is what you don't see today, but in 3 or 4 years you're going to see, and that's going to change everything.
I think, I'm going to move the subject away a little bit, although it's still around the world of technology, because I think so many of the innovations we see, they improve the customer experience. Whether we talk of the experience you just said about Snapchat or Uber or Netflix, these are things which improve the customer experience and reduce the amount of time it takes to enjoy that experience. Fantastic innovations. A lot of exciting innovations around the world, and you're obviously trying to capitalize on technology in a very exciting and liberating way. And on the other side of that, we see a sort of macroeconomic political world, which potentially seems, you could argue, is moving in a different direction. Tim and I did a session in Cannes last week, and as you might be able to tell, I'm embarrassed to say, I come from the UK today, where we have just voted out of Europe. And then we see that, what's happening politically in the US, and there seems to be some very worrying underlying trends with what's happening with consumers. And we obviously have a part to play because we both are sort of gatekeepers to what consumers are reading about the world around them. So how does that sort of, your view on sort of the macroeconomic political environment and the way that consumers are now viewing the world and the lens they're seeing through, how does that influence you and your view of how AOL is going to develop?
I think there's a couple of things there that are really important that are happening in the world. One is we talked about this at our management meeting in New York this week, is the outside world is changing a lot. I think there's an underlying thread, whether it's Brexit or what's happened in the U.S. Elections or what's happened in multiple other countries recently, that the underlying economy and growth of the economy has to include everybody and has to basically be inclusive. The internet's a very inclusive environment overall. So for us, we're always for more inclusion overall, but our opinions don't matter. We have to operate in reality, and the reality is things like Brexit will change the way that the economy works in Europe, and we have to adjust to that quickly, so we're doing that. The second thing I would just say is that from an opportunity standpoint on the consumer media side, you have more people paying attention to these type of issues than you have had in a long time. So part of our responsibility on our media property side is to take advantage of that interest. And I think whether it's the Huffington Post or TechCrunch or Engadget or the other assets that we own, how do we basically make sure for our consumer populations that we are in front of them, constantly evolving our content to keep up with that overall? And I think from our standpoint right now, although it's painful for the world to see, in our business it's an opportunity because we serve 500 to 700 million global consumers with content and video and advertising. So we have to actually, as much as we might have opinions about it, we have to shift our focus to how do we take advantage of it and help people in that work. So a lot of time we're spending internally right now is to say, reality has happened. What does reality mean for us? Interest levels high. How do we focus in very specifically and take advantage of it? So our business might work differently than a lot of other businesses because, to be honest with you, the more interest and drama there is around these things, the more traffic we are able to obtain and the more people we can educate in those things. So it's we're in a different position than most companies.
I think that's a very smart observation because, you could easily make the case that what we're seeing is a vote towards isolationism and fear, which is rather the opposite of what the internet is trying to do. But I was actually with one of your colleagues from the Huffington Post who was actually saying one of the things it's doing, it's getting a generation which has become politically agnostic. They're now engaging in media, not just in your media, but in print media, which in a way that they weren't doing 4 or 5 years ago. So hopefully we're going to get people who are going to positively activate against some of the political trends and leaders we've seen at the moment. So maybe if I think we've got time for just 2 very quick questions. I think one is, I know your career has been characterized by taking risks. I know that you've made those risks. How do you embrace risks and take risks and manage those risks within AOL?
I think one of the things we've tried to do is essentially look at risk as opportunity, and that sounds pretty basic, but the worst things that ever happen inside of our company is when one of our groups looks at an outside competitor and essentially tries to copy a competitor. It almost never works. And what does work is when our teams take essentially very large risks to figure out how to do things that other people haven't done yet. And I'll give you an example. When we bought the Huffington Post, the Huffington Post had roughly 20 million or 30 million users just in the US. It was a US-only blog site. And we said, hey, we want to expand this globally. And we weren't sure how to do it. We weren't sure how the business model was going to work. We weren't sure what countries to go to. And basically, Ariana and Jimmy Mayman and Jared Grusnow, who's the CEO, basically figured out a model to be able to drop it into countries at almost no cost and scale it. So we actually invented a way, and up front when we looked at it, we said this might fail, this may be huge risk, but the reality was the United States has 4% of the population in the world. It's it was the largest economy, but if we wanted to have Huffington Post be a global mega brand, we had to go to these other countries. We didn't have the money to do it, so we basically had to invent our way to doing it. So I think that's one. I think the second thing is just if your culture, if you want to be perfect all the time, there's a great book called Mindset, which talks about 2 things, a growth mindset versus a perfection mindset. And they talk about a lot that the perfection mindset is very dangerous. If you never want to be seen as not knowing what you're doing, or you never want to be seen as ever being outside the box of what everybody else thinks is the proper way to do things, you won't grow. If you go into a growth mindset where you look at every opportunity as a learning curve, overall, you're going to have really good outcomes. And I think fostering that culture internally is super important. Look at the most successful companies on the web today. All of them have a growth mindset, not a perfection mindset, and that's a very big difference of how you get up every morning. It's not a perfect world, and you have to operate in that sense.
What's the name of that book again?
It's called Mindset.
Mindset. I'll be buying that. So last question, I think, is just, you've got a venture capital arm, AOL Ventures. Just in the last 30 seconds ago, perhaps you could summarize what the purpose of that and what sort of areas you're moving into that, and what's the purpose of that?
Super simple. Just like we do with our business differentiation, we built a venture capital arm, which is now, I think, the largest investor. It's called Built by Girls. It invests in women founder companies overall. It's been highly successful. We're about to go raise our second fund for it in general. We're in about 30 to 40 companies right now. And having female founders as the focus of our fund has made all the difference in the world. We closed our management conference in New York yesterday with the Built by Girls Fund presenting the companies they're investing in. And if you don't think that women have a different viewpoint on technology, I'd invite you to come visit our company. And Susan Line, who's a very well-known global executive, runs it. Come visit us, and if you're a female founder, we'd love to hear from you and work with you overall. So that's our venture capital strategy is women.
Well, thank you, Tim. I think that's a very positive note to finish on. I think, as business leaders, we're faced with contradictions and conflicts, everywhere. But I think, as you can tell, Tim has a confidence and leadership skills that really set him apart, which I'm sure is part of the attraction for why Verizon acquired the AOL brand, as well as your management team, and why, of course, they've sustained you in that leadership position. So it's been a wonderful insight. Nice to meet you again.
Thanks for having us.
And on behalf of the audience, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to speak to VivaTech today.
And we'd like to thank you guys. Thank you.